So thank you for the invitation today. Always an ambitious ask to explain the state of the sector at the moment. And, what can you say about this last year that doesn't send people screaming into the abyss at the moment? But actually, I think we have a very mixed story to tell. And I'm going to talk about what's happened at the Small Charities Coalition, not because we're anything special, but because our story, I think, of the range of emotions, experiences, opportunities and challenges that lots of charities up and down the country have faced, regardless of their size as well. I'm also going to dive in and share with you some highlights from some of the research that we've done across the year, and also offer some predictions about what I think is going to happen next, in a positive vein as well. For those of you who don't know the Small Charities Coalition, we're a national umbrella body. We are the largest umbrella body for small charities. We're almost 16,000 in number across the UK as well. We were originally set up in 2008 with a focus on helping charities to capacity build and share with one another the kind of work that they've been doing. And I think when we originally started, the ambition of one charity learns a little bit about governance, then passes it on and shares it to another was absolutely the right thing to do. But when you get to 16,000 members, that becomes somewhat more of a challenge as well. We have spent this last year very much repositioning ourselves as a charity, not only in response to COVID, but also in response to the changing mindset and needs of our members as well. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the year that's just gone and what we're experiencing at the moment as a pivotal change in how charities are viewed, seen and heard in the UK. And I'll share some insights about what some of the national infrastructure bodies are doing at the moment as well. So just to start off with, so in March 2020, just as first COVID started, we had an annual turnover the year before of 125,000. Very modest, very small charity. We ourselves have capped our own ambition to, we don't want an income of more than 300,000 a year. That sounds really odd for a charity to say, but we are quite clear that as an organisation, we want to be authentic and be relatable to our members. Some may say 300 is quite high for a small charity, but we think that keeps us grounded in the reality of what our members face. A lot of our services pre-COVID were focused on face-to-face work. We very rarely use digital. And one of the thinking behind that was that actually our digital would be too clunky, too cumbersome for lots of our members to use. We ran a help desk where we answered just over 1,300 queries. We ran 54 training events, and we have what I can only describe as clunky communication channels. I started at the Small Charities Coalition on the 2nd of July 2019, or around about there. On my second day in, our website collapsed, and to my horror, I found out that our website was based on such an unusual platform that it was only available in Germany. So you can imagine some of the challenges around that as well. Just before COVID, we were about to embark and launch a new strategy, literally the week of the first lockdown, which was to focus on the smallest of the small charities, those with an income of under 300,000. We kind of were thinking ahead to what COVID meant for the sector, and we decided to go against that. So our threshold for engagement is any organisation under £1 million at the moment. We wanted to keep the larger charities in there to offer synergy, partnership and hope to a lot of the smaller charities as well. So how did we end this year? We were able, like a fair amount of charities have been able to do, a third of charities surveyed by us have said they've been able to access emergency funding. We were able to access emergency funding streams, and so we've ended this financial year with 383,000. We've increased our staff team. We started off with 3 members of staff. We have now 5, supplemented by consultants. But the biggest news story for us is not actually the growth in the help desk, which is almost doubled, 120% increase in inquiries. I can't even work out the percentage on the increase in the online events and training, but it's the nature of the relationship with our members. We have now what I think is a deeper, richer and more beneficial relationship. based on understanding exactly where they're coming from at the moment. Lots of people in the sector over the last year have talked about survey fatigue. We've been fortunate enough not to suffer from that. When we put out a survey, we get a minimum of at least 300 to 800 responses on any survey. So we've got a rich pool of data about what small charities in particular are thinking as well. And we're at that stage where we are working through a new partnership strategy at the moment, which is very much based around the whole concept of partnership working and how we work together. I think one of the issues that has been highlighted throughout this whole year is how do we measure the sector? And if you look at the original kind of discussions that happened this time last year, when we didn't quite know when the lottery funding was coming out, we didn't quite know how furlough was going to plan out. Furlough's full time for lots of organisations at that point. Everything was a quantitative analysis. We were worried about the number of organisations that were going to fold. We were worried about turnover, employment levels. Stuff, if I'm perfectly honest, that doesn't really resonate with the smaller end of the market. It was very data driven. And, you know, there's a question to be asked about whether the data that we collect as a sector is the right data. But that's a topic for another discussion completely. But what we haven't been able to do in the same way is collect qualitative data. How have people felt about their charities from where they were this time last year to where they are now? We are very clearly seeing a divide with people who are very emboldened, very passionate, enthused by the challenges that they've seen throughout this year. And then others who are completely exhausted, burnt out, and actually never want to hear the word charity ever again as well. So we've got to find a way of just keeping everybody on the same page around some of this as well. And I'd also put it to you as well that do we also need to seek alternative measures of how charity makes us feel, how the concept, the work and the vision that so many good causes have, how does that make us feel? Where is the happiness narrative in that? I know that can sound a bit crass in the context of so many of such a harsh year where so many people have lost their lives, but part of that rebuilding phase also has to be about really trying to encompass charity in a different way as well, looking beyond that value for money horizon. When the handouts are shared, you'll see this is some of the data that we've been collecting from surveys. So our first survey related to COVID came out before furlough was announced and before any emergency packaging funding was available. And you can see there was a big concern there that lots of charities would actually have to close. At least a quarter of charities small charities said they would envisage closing if they didn't have any further support. 53% at that point had already said right at the outset of lockdown that they had already started to lose funding. 34% expected to make redundancies in the next 3 months. When in April furlough was announced, then the situation calmed down a little bit. And then when we did our next survey, we found out that actually, charities have a story to tell during the pandemic. They have a contribution to make. Now it was the point that could we persuade government to allow charities to make this contribution? And I think in that we as national infrastructure bodies have really struggled, being perfectly honest. We faced a government that was in crisis mode, quite understandably, but it was also still quite sceptical of charities, was quite concerned about giving out power to charities, not knowing how they would function or how they would relate back as well. So again, a huge amount of concern there as well. 35% of small charities intended to furlough staff, which showed you the limitations of the furlough scheme at that time. There was lots of talk in the sector about whether we should see if staff from charities could volunteer back for that, for their own charity, because our work doesn't stop, especially for those charities working on crisis services. We knew that the staff was still needed, volunteers were still needed, and the work still needed to happen. But how were you going to do it without a fair budget? So I think one of the issues that COVID has done is highlight the importance of good HR management systems in the sector as well, or the lack of them. Another key point that's touched the sector this year, obviously, is around EDI, inequalities and diversity. And what we did a survey of equality groups specifically, and one of the things, and we worked across all protected characteristics. And one of the things that we discovered was that 70% of them needed less than 100,000 to keep going. Now that kind of speaks to the general lack of capacity within those protected characteristic groups, but it also talks about the challenges that those groups had in surviving. Lots of those groups didn't necessarily furlough because they were still concerned about their delivery model, and they were run largely on volunteers as well. Important points to remember. Also important to remember that routinely 48% of charities across the board don't collect demographic data on their beneficiaries. And that does speak to a question that as we move forward and funders and everybody's more aware around the EDI issues, how are we going to move organisations to be more confident and more robust in their collection of demographic data in particular? The big concerns to us, especially during the post-summer period, was around the mental health and well-being of those working and volunteering in small charities. We were absolutely stunned when, during World Mental Health Day, we released the findings of a survey where 90% of staff and volunteers felt there was insufficient support. And I would stress to anybody on this call who is a trustee in particular that you cannot underestimate the impact and the value that a focus on mental well-being within your organisation can have at this significant point as well. And as you'll see, 58% of those in charities wanted more support from trustees around the whole issue of mental well-being. There's some other surveys here that we continued with as well. We've kind of done more surveys as we're coming out of the crisis period. And one of the key things that we discovered in February was that 1 in 5 small charities working in health and social care expect to close by the end of the year. And that's because they've been heavily reliant on furlough for service delivery. They can't see at this stage any more emergency or recovery funding that's coming out. And I think that's one of the other challenges to consider as well, that lots of the funding discussions have been focused around emergency. We now need to talk about recovery, and recovery in many cases is going to be a lot more costly than crisis, because we're looking at long term, we're looking at higher risk levels around trying to get people with new types of models and services of delivery as well. And next week, just as a teaser, we've got a survey coming out on the relationship between small charities and local councils as well. And again, I would say that from the perspective of the results we've seen so far, the big good news story that has come out is that there's been a perception that local councils and small charities in particular have worked really well together. I would argue that actually that's a less positive picture that's been painted nationally, and it's much more nuanced. And what that means for the future is quite interesting as well. So just kind of taking it back to what the state of the sector is in terms of strategically how it's placed. Lots of people may or may not be aware that actually the national infrastructure bodies, NCVO, Akivo, Directory of Social Change, Charity Finance Group, my apologies to anybody I've left out, have all come together. You can see who we are listed on the Never More Needed website. And we came together with them, and we met initially for twice a week for the first 8 months of COVID, and now we meet weekly. And that was to harness all our collective energy. All of the old arguments around territorial, who's responsible for what, who does what in what place, kind of went to the side, and we tried collectively to lobby for the sector with government as well. As a small charity ourselves, our challenges around that were kind of getting our USP, getting our voice heard and contributing on a level playing field. And one of the things that struck me was right at the beginning, I was asked, because government seemed to be very sympathetic to small charities, to produce case studies. Well, we've only one staff member available to do that. That was a hell of a task for us. And it took some time for my peers in the sector to realise that we were much smaller. And could we really contribute in the volume that was needed as well? But we got through that as well. And also the partnership has looked at systems change. We've looked at how we align and how we make agreements as well. It's really focused a lot of attention around leadership in those bodies, and where do we lead to collaborate and partner for a collective success, and where do we lead our organisations as individuals. This is just to share with you that one of the, as you can imagine, when you get 15 egos in a room, all leading national charities, there could at times be some heated discussions. And so to kind of help with that, and I will say this has helped enormously with our decision-making process, we developed this partnership alignment scale, where we would ask people on difficult issues to say where they were on the scale, and that would allow us to move forward with a discussion and move more constructively. And this is, I would recommend this scale to anyone. We created it ourselves, but it really does work for us when you're trying to bring lots of diverse opinions and egos together. In terms of positive leadership and collaboration, we worked a lot on new services. There's lots of stuff in the sector around our digital and the importance of digital at the moment. But I would also put it to you that we also need to think about, how do we use digital? Is digital a means to an end, or is it the form of communication itself as well? As I said earlier, we had a lot of resistance, and we felt there was going to be a lot of resistance towards online conferencing. That wasn't the case because there was no alternative. But at the same time, we've had to invest a lot of time and resources into sharing and getting people confident on that platform as well. We've created a lot of cluster network meetings where we've divided the sector up by subsector, so we can actually deep dive into issues like domestic violence or health and social care, find out what are the policy issues that are impacting on the sector at the point as well. We introduced a new brand called Charity Cares, which is very much linked to that mental health and wellbeing piece. And part of that was about just an open space where people could catch up, had no agenda, people could catch up, whether it was personal, professional, or the state of the world, it was absolutely fine. We've introduced a program of participatory grant making, and we've personalized communications. Everybody gets a personalized response from us. Don't use any automated responses. And that has been invaluable in building confidence amongst the membership. It's been very difficult as a small charity to manage that, but that personalised contact is what our members have asked for and what we've sensed has been needed. That in itself has created lots of positivities in terms of a sense of community, reduced sense of isolation, and obviously increased opportunities for collaboration. The less positive examples of partnership working that we've seen in the sector is that often corporates have been the first to offer, but the last to deliver. I think there was a hiatus where corporates kind of said, oh, well, we're not going to be affected in the same way as charities. Of course, we want to do this good now. We've got some downtime amongst our staff team. But what we found was that actually when corporates were trying to help, they were actually becoming very, very complicated. And things weren't going in the way that charities could easily absorb as well. We also have to consider our psychological attachment to the perfection of partnerships. And I think what's really interesting is that the best partnerships that have operated during COVID have been those where money hasn't been at the source, where there hasn't been a discussion about, where it hasn't started off by saying, here's a pot of money, how do we divide it up? It's about, here's the vision, here's the need, how do we address this? And that's meant that sometimes, partnerships haven't always had service level agreements or all the contracts or all the nuances that we normally expect around them in place, but it's worked. And obviously working with central government has been a continual challenge for the national bodies. Equality, diversity and inclusion, that's something that has come to the fore. How much of this has arisen as a result of COVID and how much of this was just a burning point that was going to erupt at some point in the sector is difficult to tell. But one thing I would put to you from this conversation is that the perception that all charities are progressive. And I think we need to remember that if charities are truly reflective of society, then there are people in charities that are also anti the equality agenda as well. And how do we work with those individuals? Do we call them out? Do we target them on social media? Or do we try to explain and work with them as well? And that's something that I think we need to still work on extensively within the sector as well. And how do we create safe conversations? When people don't know whether to use the phrase BAME or people of colour, when they don't know how discussions are to be framed in a way that's inclusive, how do we have the intellectual the emotional and the kind of cultural capital to be able to take those discussions apart in a safe space. I would say the way we're discussing EDI at the moment in the sector, it doesn't feel safe to anyone, whether you're affected directly by EDI, or whether you're trying to make good in the sector. It doesn't feel safe for anyone. And obviously, both from that individual reconnection that people want with the physical environment, to their own heightened or personal and collective awareness of environmental change, but also what charities can do in that space as well. And we will obviously, with COP and all the initiatives around that funders are taking, also start to see more people engaging around the environmental discussion over the next year as well. How we get charities to look beyond their own green housekeeping policies to understand their contribution to the environment, I think it's going to be a very interesting piece of work. Just coming to the end now. So some of the lessons we've learned, that staff, volunteer, health, wellbeing is a happy organisation, is an effective organisation. One of our new planks for our strategy is going to be, we want to be a happy organisation. And we've put that virtually front and centre of the draft of our new strategy, because we feel from that everything else can stem. One of my kind of pet hates during this whole pandemic has been the phrase working at pace, and the idea that everyone's had to work much, much quicker. I would argue that it's not just about working at pace, but it's about working to your strengths and skills. And that whole piece around partnership working has allowed a lot of people to kind of identify new skills and strengths that maybe we just didn't realise were lying dormant before the pandemic as well. I've said it before that collaboration is better initiated without discussions of funding. And if we can keep that going in the future, then I think the sector does have a very promising future, especially amongst small charities as well. One thing I would say to anybody who's an infrastructure body on there as well, that we need time to think about how we rebuild. Some of the problems that we saw in the sector about BAME and organisations and marginalised groups not getting their fair share of the money was down to historical roots about how we view capacity building. And do we need to move away from the show somebody how to fish and empowerment model to actually saying we need to do this for you so that you can build on a strong foundation to actually deliver the work that you want to do as well. And a key point as well, a lot of what we say in the sector is around the term resilience. And again, I'd rather provocatively, I will put it to you that maybe it's not resilience we need to be talking about, but perseverance. Because in resilience, we're presuming that the individual has to adapt to their environment. And in doing that, we're presuming that the environment is in the way that we need it to be, whether that's political or social. So if you're asking people to become more resilient to cope with the impact of COVID or to cope with the challenges of EDI, then actually we're upholding those systems as well. Do we need to be able to give people the strength and the courage to be more persistent? So what next? Well, obviously we've got volunteer and workforce recruitment, retention pressures emerging, big issues around health and wellbeing. That's becoming top of everybody's agenda, even more so than funding at the moment. We've got the administrative changes and the funding opportunities that may or may not arise, as in the Queen's Bill yesterday. And we've got to move this funding dial. We've got to get small charities in particular away from this high dependency on grant-making trusts to a more mixed economy. The Social Value Act, reinvigorated as it is, the whole commissioning process does allow for opportunities, but actually we've got to create the space for those to be absorbed as well. And my big fear about where we are at the moment is that are we about to see the politicisation of funding? The cultural wars, we've seen what the government's done in its control of the lottery. We're fearful that actually that could continue going forward. How do we actually challenge some of that? And, you know, I'm seeing some of the lottery funders moving on to alternative platforms, digital platforms at the moment that look very similar to how the government has its beta website, is what to worry as well. So on that mixed note, I shall end.